Aside from the Pharisees' unwillingness to recognize the messiahship of Jesus, there was perhaps no hotter issue or source of friction than that of the question of keeping the Sabbath. You see, as we had noted last week, the invalid who was healed by Jesus, there was a focus on the day rather than on the deed. There in John 5, 6 through 10, we had read, when Jesus saw him lying there and knew he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" And the sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. And while I am going, another steps down before me." And Jesus said to him, "Get up, take up your bed and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Now, that day was the Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed." Now that day was the Sabbath. One commentator writes, this is Whedon, he says, "The Jews held that even the Sabbath might be broken at the prophet's command, adducing the sabbatical overthrow of Jericho by Joshua's order. If a prophet shall say unto thee to transgress the words of the law, hear him except to commit idolatry. See, the healed man complied with the command of Jesus to pick up his bed and walk in verse 9, and even acknowledged that he had done so in verse 11. But this brought swift reaction from some of the Jews. What should have been something of rejoicing and something of wonder, one healed of something that really was incurable, was met with the staunch rebuke of Jews focused on their orthodox and traditional views of the law and keeping the law. He was carrying a burden on the Sabbath. William Barclay writes, "The law had simply said the Sabbath day must be different than other days, and that on it neither a man nor his servants nor his animals must work. The Jews had set out to define what work was. They had set out 39 different classifications of work. One of these classifications was that work constituted the carrying of a burden," perhaps drawn, as we had noted last week, from a reference in Jeremiah 17, 19 to 27. But Jesus says, but what about my Father? John 5, 16 to 18. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." This was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. Works were ongoing. This was Jesus' defense that his Father was at work. He, that is Jesus, Whedon writes, he placed his works on a par with the Father's work and justified his Sabbath action on the same ground as justifies God. He was no more bound to withhold his healing power on the Sabbath than God was bound to arrest the progress of vegetation or the waves of the ocean. And that this parallel infuriated the Jews. Jesus' claim to have the right to do as God was seen as placing himself on an equal level with God. Jesus, or God, is at work to this day. And though this goes back to the creation, and on the seventh day God rested because the work was completed that he had done. But God is always at work, even though he's not always acknowledged as what his hand is involved in and what his powers are continuing to do. So let us consider the Sabbath keeping. The Sabbath keeping. The Pharisees were great about building these fences around the law, which stemmed from great respect for the original law. William Coleman, in his book, The Pharisees' Guide to Total Holiness, he writes this. He says, "There is a club that meets regularly, and each time they open their session with very funny practices. However, not everyone laughs at the practice. In fact, you can always tell who is new at the club. The newcomers are fighting back a giggle, but those who have been around a while don't see anything humorous about it. They have done it so long, they no longer see its humor. The Pharisaic mentality may have been conditioned the same way, he goes on to say. It may even be based on a fear of God, a fear of God's law being broken. He goes on to say, they had so much respect for the original set of scriptures and wanted to protect them so desperately that they started adding to them. Then after a while, it not only seemed helpful to make additions, but absolutely essential. When Jesus began his ministry, he saw these new laws as absurd. Yet the Pharisees saw nothing odd in the practice. They had been doing it a long time. These fence laws were the sayeg. Sayeg means fence laws or hedge laws that were built around the law. A wall of tradition around the law. And they had hundreds of these laws to define and to protect the law. They contrived a fence of Pharisaic rules that if man would keep them, it would guarantee a safe distance between himself and the law of God. You see, the Pharisees had they become the self-appointed moral policemen of the day. They were always on the watch for those who would break the law. Even in Mark chapter 3 and verses 1 through 2, there we read again, he entered the synagogue and a man was there with a withered hand, and they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath so that they might accuse him. Moral policemen who learned to direct traffic, but had they really learned to care as Jesus was trying to help them to recognize the mercy and the caring, the compassion that he had for others. The Sabbath was to be kept holy. In Exodus chapter 20 and verses 8 through 11, we read, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Again, here, going back to the original in creation, but then established with the law and the regulation there to give rest, not only for oneself, but also for one's sons and daughters, and also rest for the servants, and even rest for the livestock. To keep anything holy would be to keep it or to use it as it was intended. Not to misuse it or to adulterate it. But it was set aside as a day of rest. Humanity needed rest from his labors. It protected man from himself, of becoming a workaholic. And we live in a world of workaholics that work 7 days a week. And they've got to work 7 days to make enough money to pay for the things that they have that they don't have time to enjoy because they're having to work all the time. Man needs some rest. Man needs time to rejuvenate himself. Man needs some time for recreation, and because it helps not only the body but also the mind to rest from the labor. It also provides time or opportunity to spend time with the family rather than family being neglected because one is working all the time. So what constituted work? Among some references we find, because work, you couldn't work, you couldn't move stones, that if a house caved in on someone, it was stated that Jews might try to decide which end of the rubble the head might be on, and in order to not do too much work, they'd at least uncover the head. And it was mused among the Jews that if such a situation occurred, that they would pray that a Gentile might come along. Also, one whose occupation was sewing, if he walked out of his house on the Sabbath day and had a needle stuck in his garment, he would have been guilty of work because he was carrying his work with him. Or if one had been sowing, and then on the Sabbath day, it might be better to wear a different garment, lest there be a seed in his pocket or on the garment that might fall out or fall off into the ground and germinate. And if it germinated, they would be guilty of having worked, having sown seed on the Sabbath day. There's several sabbatical or Sabbath occurrences where Jesus was criticized. One of those we find in Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 5, when the disciples were picking grain. There we read, on a Sabbath, while he was going through the grain fields, his disciples plucked and ate some heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands. But some of the Pharisees said, why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath? And Jesus answered them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those with him. And he said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Here they were seen as harvesting and threshing. As they picked the grain, there was the harvesting and rubbing it in their hands, separating in their hands, guilty of threshing on the Sabbath day. But Jesus ingeniously brings up an example in the life of David. And one of the last things that the Pharisees would want to do is to criticize David for something that he had done. And yet, here we find that David and his men, they ate of the bread that was not lawful for them to eat, but it was needful, it was necessary, it was all that was available, and they needed some bread, and so it was given to them out of the need and out of compassion for them. We also have 5 cases of Jesus healing on the Sabbath. There was a man with a withered or shriveled hand that we note in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 10. A woman with a bowed back in Luke 13 and verse 11. A man with dropsy in Luke 14 verses 1 through 2. The invalid in John 5:5, as we noted last week and reminded you of at the beginning of this lesson this morning. And a man who had been blind from birth, John 9 and verse 14. The approach, as Coleman writes, if God said don't work, then to play it safe, don't even pick grain on the Sabbath. Don't even heal people, because that might be a borderline case. But let us consider some questions from Jesus. When his actions were called into question, he turned the question on his critics. Have you not read? In Matthew chapter 12, verses 3 through 8, there we read, he said to them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry? And those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests? Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Okay, a similar reference to what we noted in Luke chapter 6. But not only does Jesus here refer back to David, but he also refers to the priests going about their work even on the Sabbath, and in that they were fulfilling the law of the sacrifices that were necessary, that were to be done, that they were obligated to do on even the Sabbath days. You know, there was always the morning and evening sacrificed every day, besides other offerings that were brought, sin offerings and thank offerings. And so here we have them doing their work even on the Sabbath day. But Jesus tries to draw attention to the idea of mercy above the sacrifice and the way one is with others. Another question is, what about your ox or donkey? Jesus tries to turn things on them to consider their own actions and where there was inconsistency in their thinking as they were charging Jesus with work. Luke 13:10-17, there we read, "Now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and behold, there was a woman who had a disabling spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and could not fully straighten herself. And when Jesus saw her, he called her over and said to her, 'Woman, you are freed from your disability.' And he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight, and she glorified God. But the ruler of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, said to the people, 'There are 6 days in which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be healed, and not on the Sabbath day.' Then the Lord answered him, 'You hypocrites, does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead him away to water him? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 years, be loosed from the bond on the Sabbath day?' As he said these things, all his adversaries were put to shame, and all the people rejoiced at all the glorious things that were done by him." Don't you untie your donkey? Don't you let them have a drink on even the Sabbath day? And your ox. Well, how about the freedom for this woman from what had held her captive for so long? But they were indignant at what Jesus did on the Sabbath. But it's interesting also that they, as the Pharisees tell the people, there's 6 days you can come and be healed. But don't do it on the Sabbath day. Not a denial of Jesus' power to heal. And yet, they would not accept Jesus as the Messiah and criticize him. The focus not on the healings, but the focus on the day of the week. And saying he was doing work on the Sabbath day. But what is of more value? Is another question Jesus throws at them in Matthew chapter 12, verses 9-14. He went on from there and entered their synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand, and they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" And so that they might accuse him. And he said to them, "Which one of you who has a sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value is a man than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And the man stretched it out and was restored, healthy like the other. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him how to destroy him. They witnessed the miracle, and yet they still continued to seek to destroy Jesus. Though they would help their animals, they criticized Jesus for helping this man. And then in Luke 6:6-9, is it lawful to do good? Jesus asked the question. On another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was withered, and the scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath so that they might find a reason to accuse him. But he knew their thoughts, and he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come and stand here." And he rose and stood there. And Jesus said to them, "I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to destroy it?" Again, same account, but here the questions as Luke records it here. Is it lawful to do good? Is it lawful to save life? And what about the whole man? John 7:21-24. Jesus answered them, "I did one work, and you all marvel at it. Moses gave you circumcision, not that it was from Moses, but from the fathers, and you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision, so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well? Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment." Coleman writes, "It has been said that those who are capable of loving very deeply are also capable of hating just as deeply. Many religious people confuse sincerity with fanaticism. Sincerity deals with the dedication and commitment. Fanaticism affects our judgment and behavior, causing us to do things that are absurd and contrary to our better instincts. Here, all the more, they are desiring to destroy Jesus. John 5:18 says they wanted to kill Jesus. Out of their fanaticism for the law and their fence laws around the law, they opposed Jesus and accused him of working on the Sabbath. But the Sabbath was made for man. As Mark 2:27-28, we find Jesus here. He said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." It was for man's benefit, for man's happiness, for man's protection, as we've noted, to keep man from becoming an alcoholic. One commentator writes, "For man's whole body, for body and soul, for physical rest, for mental and social improvement, for his spiritual and moral growth, and for his eternal salvation. It was for his rest from toil, the cares and anxieties of the world, to give an opportunity to call off his attention from earthly concerns and to direct it to the affairs of eternity. It was a kind provision for man that he might refresh his body by relaxing his labors." And Coleman writes that many of the Jews agreed with Jesus. More than once the rabbis said the Sabbath was given for the people and not people for the Sabbath. Even the contemporary of Christ, the Rabbi Hillel, was rescued in a snowstorm on the Sabbath, and he agreed that the laws were suspended when life was in danger. Life was more sacred than the law. And isn't that what Jesus was trying to get across in drawing the parallel between what they do with their animals and yet what he was able to free individuals from, even on the Sabbath? Jesus went further and insisted that not only was life more sacred, but likewise health and kindness were also more important. There was a focus on God's love and mercy. God's laws were constructed to help, not to hinder, to help and to not hurt people. And so we also need to guard against a Pharisaic thinking ourselves as we accept the commands of our Lord as they are. It can happen, and Pharisaism does happen. It is not dead today. It does arise. Coleman writes, "It is not long until those laws which began as opinion move smoothly to commandments and then become even greater than the injunctions of the Bible itself. The more organized some become, the more they want to establish extra laws to govern conduct and personal morality. In some segments of modern Christianity, the great truths have boiled down to this: we are trying to read our lifestyles into the Bible rather than find guidance from it." How is it that we are focusing on the commands of God? He goes on to state, "The questions of sexual morality become just as fragile. If we dance, who knows where it might lead? Back up 2 steps and build a fence. Some movies could corrupt. 2 more steps back and build another fence. Who knows where wine at mealtime might lead? Again, step back, more fence." Eventually, we're no longer wrestling with the core problems of drunkenness and adultery, but rather we are fighting mock battles at the new fences that we have erected. Now the new laws become the really important battlegrounds rather than focusing on the commands of God and how they are intended to direct our lives. We need to use good discernment and guide our lives, but we need to guard against making laws. Acknowledge needs and what is of value. Remember the difference between the priest, the Levite, and the Samaritan who was called good when they encountered the man who had fell victim to the robbers. Is our religion getting in the way of righteous living? Again, noting Jesus' words in Matthew, drawn from Matthew 12, 7-8. And if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Are we walking in the steps of Jesus? May we mercifully follow in the Lord's steps. And as we seek to follow the commands of God, let us not forget about mercy. Let us not forget about caring. Let us not forget about helping in the needs that are there. But let us follow in Jesus' steps where we recognize the great needs of humanity. And when we are in a position to help, then let us help as is necessary, rather than regulating those things away either as somebody else's responsibility or can't do it today. Let us follow in the steps of our Lord.